Welcome to Embargoed, a podcast featuring intelligent talk about sanctions, export controls, and all things international trade for trade nerds and normal human beings alike. I am one of your hosts, Brian Fleming. I'm here as always with my friend, colleague, and co-host, Mr. Tim O'Toole, on this wet and cold Friday morning here in Washington, D.C. What is up, Tim?
Lovely weather we're having, Brian. It is, at least we're not Texas, or if we're in Texas, we would be with Ted Cruz in Cancun.
No, we would never make that mistake. But yes, indeed, it is cold. It is pretty gross outside. We are happy to be inside recording this podcast. Welcome to everybody to the latest episode of Embargoed. Thank you all for joining us once again. Thanks to everybody who listened to the most recent episode about Myanmar. We're gonna, not surprisingly, circle back to that at the end of the program. But today we have a very special episode. We have some guests with us today, which we will introduce in just a moment. But before we do that, just the normal introductory notes. We are not here giving legal advice. We are not here discussing any confidential information. Any of the opinions that you hear today are mine and Tim and those of our guests. They are not our respective law firms' opinions. Please blame us if you don't like what we're telling you. Don't blame the people we work for. And you can, as always, find us anywhere, Apple, Spotify, Google, Stitcher, Overcast, YouTube. If you enjoy the pod, please subscribe. Please give us a rating, a 5-star rating, hopefully. And as always, we're here every 2 weeks. And again, very excited to have some guests with us today. And in particular, and I'll just jump right into the roadmap and then we'll introduce our guests. We have teased this for the last couple episodes, but obviously Tim and I have spent a lot of time the last few months talking about all of the big changes coming on the U.S. side with the new election and all of the policy landscape shifting significantly. And so we want to do a bit of over the next couple months, we want to sort of do a tour around the world to sort of see not only how things are, what's going on in the U.S. is affecting other parts of the world, but also to hear from others about what is going on in their own home countries and regions and how things are changing rapidly there as well. And to do that, we want to start with one of our closest allies, who I think we didn't manage to completely alienate over the last 4 years, maybe alienate just a little.
We still have a special relationship, Brian.
We still do, I'm told. Thankfully, we haven't completely alienated our friends over in the UK. So we're starting in the UK, and we have two guests that I'm going to introduce in just a moment. And we're going to spend the bulk of our time focused on UK issues, finding out what is happening post-Brexit. We know we have a number of listeners in the UK, but I think this is a great opportunity for those who are listening in the US and other parts of the world to get some good insight into what's happening in the UK and what may be coming up over the next months and years in a post-Brexit UK. And then so that's going to be the bulk of our program. And then we're going to wrap up with a lightning round where we're going to hit Myanmar again with the new executive order being issued, Yemen, and then two favorites, WeChat and TikTok, to check back in with them. And that'll be a wrap for today. So without further delay, let me get right to it and introduce our guests. So we are very grateful and happy to have, I think we're fair to say, friends of the pod, friends of our law firm, friends of ours who we've been lucky enough to collaborate with and work with over the last few years. We have based in London, partner at Stevenson Harwood, Sue Millar is with us. And also then representing a little further north, based in Edinburgh, Tom Stocker with Pinson Masons is with us. And so we welcome Sue and Tom to Embargoed. How are you both doing this Friday afternoon?
Good. It's raining here too.
Extremely well, thank you. It's very sunny here in Scotland, as always. I've got my whiskey in the background, a little plug for Scottish whiskey. This is a great talk. So thank you for the invitation.
And always go to Scotland for the weather. I mean, of the three places on the pod, Scotland is the sunny place. This is once in a lifetime, I think. That's
Indeed.
great.
Up is down, black is white, Scotland is sunny. So there you go. So I think we want to. So we're going to have a bit of a kind of a round table here. We have a number of topics we want to get to. I think as I sort of said at the outset, obviously we've had a lot of upheaval here in the States with the sort of tail end of the policy shifts under the Trump administration. Now already some big reversals and some reconsiderations under the Biden administration. Obviously in the UK we have the turmoil and the tumult that has come along with Brexit and negotiating an exit, and then of course 11 p.m. on the last day of December, we have the sort of that wind down period is now officially over, and we are in a post-Brexit UK. So let me just start, Sue, with you in terms of just for our audience who might not be as familiar with sort of some of the contours of this, what this looks like, what changes this has really brought about, just sort of big picture wise, what has already happened and sort of what are you expecting sort of in the early stages of the post-Brexit UK trade reality?
I guess the first thing I would say is that this is not the end of Brexit. We have not negotiated a deal and it's all done and dusted.
Right.
It's a trade and cooperation agreement, which requires constant reviews and a review after 5 years. So we're effectively going to be negotiating Brexit for the next 20 or 30 years, I would say. And the other thing that's really important to recognise is that there is nothing in the current Brexit deal at all to deal with services, or pretty much nothing. And there is, again, nothing to deal with financial services. So again, what we can expect in the next couple of months, provided that everybody doesn't get too irritated with one another, is some kind of memorandum of understanding to deal with, relations between the city and the financial system, the UK financial system, and how it plugs into the EU financial system.
So let me come back to that in a minute, but Tom, what about you? What about some high level kind of initial thoughts on where we are now versus
certainly
2 months ago?
3 points. We have tariff-free trade between the UK and the EU, subject to very complicated rules of origin provisions that people are grappling with. But of course, what we also have for the very first time in 45 years is export controls between the UK and the EU. Now, the export controls are relatively simple. There's an open general license, but you have to register and you have to comply with the terms of the license, which is new. We also have 30 new country-specific trade sanctions regimes, and while they were supposed to mirror the EU's trade sanctions, lawyers being lawyers couldn't resist the temptation to make some changes, and therefore they don't exactly mirror the EU sanctions, and therefore we have an autonomous, separate UK sanctions regime that is different from the EU regime. And the third point is there's a trade bill going through the UK Parliament currently, and the House of Lords have just amended that bill, or seeking to amend it, to require that before the UK government enters into any international trade agreements, it undertakes a human rights assessment of the country. And if you tie that back to the fact that we've got a new human rights sanctions regime, I think we can see that human rights is going to be a big topic in UK trade and sanctions going forward.
Just on that last point, how similar? I have read a bit about this and have heard a bit about this from other colleagues in the UK and the EU. But how similar is that regime to what we have in the States in terms of the global Magnitsky type? Essentially, the U.S. has authority to go after, OFAC has authority to go after human rights, abusers anywhere around the world, and target them for sanctions. For economic sanctions, for blocking sanctions. So how does that, at least the proposal or the frameworks, are shaped up?
So there is already a global human rights sanction regime in place that was put in place at the end of last year. I think there's about 70 individuals have been added to the sanctions list as a result. So it gives you the authority to impose asset freezes on individuals and entities where a state has violated an individual's right to life, right not to be tortured or to be free from slavery. And the two areas that they're primarily targeting at the moment are Russia in connection with Magnitsky and Saudi Arabia as well. So I think it's very similar, and I think that's an area we'll see quite a lot of targeted sanctions being imposed under. So, Sue, do you have any views on that?
I think.
No, I think it is very, I agree with you. I think it is very similar. What is interesting is that the UK put out its Magnitsky style sanctions a little bit in advance of the EU. But although they are very similar, if you compare the wording, the EU one is actually wider.
Yeah, that was where I wanted to jump in. As a practical matter, I mean, now we have a different UK sanctions authority, some different human rights sanctions, and the authorities for human rights sanctions. But how different is it going to be post-Brexit in terms of these sorts of sanctions compared to the way it was when Britain was when the UK was in the EU?
Well, that's a really good question because the UK was one of the big beasts of sanctions policy in the EU. And it is really going to be interesting to see what happens within the EU going forward. And it's the other thing that's really interesting is that the UK has reviewed the designations that were made pursuant to the EU sanctions regime, and has actually removed several in excess of 100 entities and individuals from the sanctions lists on the basis that it's not satisfied that those individuals and entities meet the criteria.
Yeah.
So it looks like it's games. Go ahead, Tom.
It feels like a little bit games playing to me.
I think what I find interesting is that we do have this autonomous regime now. In the main, the UK's foreign policy will align with the EU's foreign policy. We've been very close to them for 45 years and informing that. But we do have areas of the world where we have particular and separate interests. So, for example, Hong Kong. Britain has a unique position when it comes to Hong Kong because of the history. Russia as well, if there was any further instances of British citizens being targeted on British soil, then you could see that a separate sanctions, asset freeze provisions could be put in place.
I was going to circle back to one thing that I think Sue alluded to right at the outset, and I think is coming back around here in terms of the new regime, which is the idea that services and financial services in particular remain kind of a undefined, not sort of well understood sort of how that's going to play or work into the new sanctions regime. I wonder what either of you would think in terms of the prospect that the UK sanctions regime and sanctions enforcers and regulators could potentially leverage London's position in the global financial system, and in particular in the sort of European financial system, in the way that OFAC leverages New York and the US banking system. Any connection, obviously the OFAC approach has developed over the years that any connection to a US bank, to New York, to a correspondent account sitting at anywhere in the US, it's fair game for US jurisdiction to apply and potentially for violations to be found. I wonder if you think that there's any appetite for something that aggressive or that we could be seeing with respect to London.
That the right to take a long-arm jurisdiction has been reserved, I think, in the regulations dealing with civil enforcement of sanctions abuses. However, I think we have to recognise the politics here. The UK is now sitting between the US and the EU. Its position is somewhat uncertain, notwithstanding that we're happily describing ourselves as global Britain. And I have to question what political appetite there's going to be to really rock the boat and really try and be the big enforcer alongside the US.
I agree with that. And the other point is that at the moment, under the existing sanctions, the UK can take territorial jurisdiction if part of a sanctions breach goes through the city of London or through a UK bank. So we don't actually need any further extension of the law. It's just having the appetite to be as aggressive in the enforcement as we perceive the US authorities to be.
Right, and that tends to be the more interesting question, right? Is if it's there and it's kind of discretionary or a policy judgment, is there the will or the appetite to do that?
And it sounds like right now there might not be, because the UK is actually still trying to work a number of things out with the EU. On that point, it's kind of the flip side to the question. How much appetite do you think there's going to be in the UK and the EU for continued cooperation on these issues? Because I know that the UK's intelligence function was actually very important to the EU's sanctions function, and now that there's separation. I'm wondering if there's going to be that sort of cooperation on sanctions issues that there was before Brexit.
My personal take is that they will continue to be very closely aligned. It's in the interest of the UK and it's in the interest of the EU to adopt similarly aligned positions, and I think that applies equally in relation to the concerns that are shared about the long-arm jurisdiction, the extraterritorial jurisdiction of the US. It's a difficult, as I keep saying, the UK is now in a difficult position, but I think it will continue to align to the extent possible.
Yeah, I agree with that, and you can see that already with the response in respect of Navalny and the issues around Nord Stream 2, because France and Germany have come out with opposing views on what should be done. Britain is staying completely neutral, and it's talking about working with its international partners. So I don't think, with some exceptions, I think Britain in the main will seek to work closely with the EU and also with the US, and to try and find a common position, and the key area around that will be Iran.
Yeah, well, actually, there was some news this morning about Iran. I think there's a conference, I guess, a security conference going on in Munich, at least virtually, and the U.S. has announced that they want to restart the Iran talks. I think the leadership on that might have come out of Britain and France and Germany. And so I'm wondering, kind of on Iran, where do you see that headed at this point in terms of, leadership from the UK, in terms of negotiations, in terms of what's next?
Again, the UK has very recently aligned itself again with France and Germany with regard to calling on Iran to comply with all of its obligations under the JCPOA 1.0. And the way I see it is that the UK will want to take, I think the UK will want to take a major role in bringing the US into the discussions and aligning themselves with the EU, so that there can be a renegotiation of the deal, or the US coming back into the deal as quickly as possible.
I agree. Iran, I think, is of interest to Britain because of, again, our historical ties with Iran and the Middle East. We feel we should be taking a major role. They'll want to work with the EU and the US to try and find an enhanced, comprehensive plan of action. I checked out last night the UK government's guidance on doing business with Iran to see if there'd been any change, and there hasn't been. The last update was back in September, and the guidance says the UK government supports expanding trade relationships with Iran and encourages UK businesses to take advantage of the commercial opportunities arising from the lifting of sanctions. And I think we all on this know well that the reality is extremely different.
Right.
But that is.
How's that working for them? I mean, it seems like there's really nothing going on at this point in Iran with respect to trade, or at least very little, because you can't get paid if you're sending stuff over to Iran. I mean,
well, certainly not, and certainly not with respect to the UK. Maybe right. in some other pockets, but not in the UK.
No, the EU and UK blocking regs.
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's almost impossible.
Yeah. So the blocking regs that were put in place to stop the long reach of the US secondary sanctions have had absolutely zero impact.
I was going to say, have you been? So we've Tim and I have both dealt with these issues. I have not personally dealt with them in respect to the UK. I have in Germany and Italy and some other countries where we've had clients that have run into issues with the blocking regs. But have you seen much activity there in term? I've seen it mostly with sort of private actions that have been brought by, aggrieved parties who are saying, well, they're not being honest about why they're walking away from their obligations. It's really because they're worried about U.S. sanctions. Have you seen much of that at all, or did it sort of all kind of quietly subside, over the last couple of years when the reinstitution of the sanctions happened in late 2018?
What has been interesting from my perspective is the lack of interest of the prosecuting authorities in each of the jurisdictions. If you do report a clear breach of the blocking regulation, the competent authorities usually fight between themselves to hand it over to someone else like a hot potato.
That sounds about right.
Yeah,
That's a very U.S. approach. It's not my problem, it's your problem. Yeah.
well, I was talking to somebody in Germany who tried to report something related to the blocking violation in Germany, and there's apparently a fax number that is completely unmonitored in Germany where you send these things. And he tried to track down like where it actually went to, and it really was this room that had a fax machine and nothing else there, and nobody paying attention to it. It sounds like the UK is not that far off.
I think they would take a case if it was clear cut. The problem is that the laws actually gives a wide room to avoid committing an offence. So it's a criminal offence to comply with the secondary sanctions, but you're allowed to make your own commercial decisions. You're allowed to avoid doing business with Iran because to do so you'd have to be paid through a third-party banking route, which gives rise to money laundering risk. So you can justify these decisions. Most of the activity I've seen in this area concerns the approach the banks are taking. And is it appropriate for a bank to still have a sanctions clause that says you won't do business with Iran? And how do you navigate, or how do you align those sorts of provisions with the blocking regulations, and that's where a lot of the kind of contractual legal work has arisen. But to answer your question, Tim, up until 2018, Britain, France, Italian, German companies saw Iran as a huge opportunity. They were rushing into the market. They then started seeing the practical difficulties of getting paid. But as soon as the secondary sanctions were brought in place, it was far too difficult and too scary for most companies, and they withdrew.
And that aligns, I think, perfectly with what we have seen advising on the U.S. side. It's a mirror image of that. It's our non-U.S. clients who have dealt with this, or who did, reinvigorate their ties to Iran over the 2016 to 2018 period. I think have dealt with a lot of headache trying to disentangle.
But they've still got the ties, and people are keeping their relationships warm. Perfectly lawful to do so. There's huge investment opportunities in Iran, and if the diplomats can get the joint plan of action back on the table, and perhaps a better agreement in place, then I think there would be a significant reinvestment in Iran, which would be the benefit of British and international companies. Appreciate that the US companies would still be excluded from the market unless Mr. Biden's able to pull off the deal of the century.
So one follow-up there, which we've heard a lot about, certainly, is, maybe Sue. I mean, we were just talking about obviously the prospects of UK companies trying to re-engage with Iran if there is a JCPOA 2.0, if there is sort of a easing of the sanctions once again from the US. Do you, just sort of handicapping the likelihood that UK companies and maybe even other EU companies will be willing to do that, given that they sort of got burned the first time around because there's the volatility in the US political situation? Trump survived a second impeachment. He could run again in 3.5 years. We're all sort of smiling at that, but it's not out of the question. And we could be right back. This could be, to use an old U.S. movie reference, it could be like Groundhog Day, and we're doing this all again in 5 years if there is a deal. So, what do you think tolerance is there for UK companies, given that this first go round didn't go so well in terms of the mess that was created by the US withdrawal.
I think there's still continuing interest. I mean, there has to be. There are 80 million people, with pent up, the sophisticated consumer society. So there is interest, but I think people will be cautious. And what we saw first time around was that the EU went in with both feet, really got going. I mean, the Germans in particular were very sophisticated. Were sending trade delegations across all the time, and you'd just bump into them when you were in Tehran. The UK was more muted, but the key thing I think for UK business is going to be the ability to process payments. That is the key so far as the UK is concerned.
And
Yeah,
again,
I was going to.
no, go
I
ahead,
was
Tim.
just going to
Go
say
ahead.
in JCPOA 2.0, if it comes to that, I think there's at least two components that are going to have to be satisfied that really aren't right now. I mean, the first is the payments that you mentioned, Sue. I mean, it didn't work the last time. Even in the good years, it was a real problem getting paid. The second, and I think this is what Iran is already talking about in response to the Biden overture, is there's got to be a mechanism so that nobody can withdraw unilaterally once everyone's in compliance. Like there was a mechanism to snap back, but that assumed non-compliance. But there was nothing in the agreement that said as long as it's going well, nobody can leave, and I think that was because nobody imagined that was going to be the result. But now that we've seen it, I think that's really got the issue that's got to be addressed first.
I can verify the fact that, given that I was still in government when JCPOA was getting finalized and then implemented on the, across the board here, the snapback provisions were entirely designed to prevent the Iranians from sort of falling short of their obligations, and there was never a thought that that the U.S. or one of the other sort of parties to the deal were going to just sort of turn around and walk away, disavow it. So I agree. That would be, I think, is probably a safeguard that's going to have to be built in if there's a new version.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. It all went one way, didn't it?
Yes, exactly. Well, let's maybe pivot for a second to another favorite topic of ours that we talk about on the podcast a lot, which Tom alluded to, Hong Kong and the sort of special relationship that the UK has with Hong Kong due to the historical ties. We have spent a lot of time over the last year talking about the situation in Hong Kong, talking about the situation in China more broadly, the national security law, obviously, that got passed in Hong Kong, the anti-democratic sort of trends that we see there, the human rights issues that are coming to light every day, not just in Hong Kong, but in other parts of China. This has been, I think, and will continue to be, even though Iran, I think, in terms of the shared interest and ways in which the US and the UK, I think, clearly will need to probably work together going forward. China is one where the US obviously kind of went it alone over the last few years and sort of decided to fight China for what it was worth kind of on its own. What do you see, again, in sort of we'll just continue to call it post-Brexit, even though I take your point that we're going to be negotiating Brexit for years to come. In a post-Brexit UK, just in terms of, again, sanctions authorities, trade, export controls, which has become a huge issue, obviously, between the US and China. Tom, you touched on that initially in terms of some export controls changes. What do you foresee in terms of UK and China, if there will be any changes, if there will be any perhaps more, not to say this in a disparaging way, but perhaps more backbone or more sort of aggressiveness of the UK toward China in the coming years, now that you're able to sort of chart your own path a little bit more?
I think the UK is very concerned about what has happened in relation to Xinjiang. They're very concerned about the security situation in Hong Kong. You've seen, I think, a few signals around that, including, the UK's willingness to grant visas it's a path to up to 3 million Hong Kongers becoming British citizens, which in itself was somewhat ironic, given that Some would say that Brexit was formed on immigration
Right.
grounds. Um, the real question that I don't think I have an answer to is how brave the UK is going to be in its policy vis-a-vis China. I think it was probably envisaging up until relatively recently that part of its global Britain strategy would be developing a better relationship with China. Is it going to poke the bear though? I don't think so.
Yeah. I don't think they will either. And actually, I think they'll try and build a positive, constructive relationship and try and encourage China to have more discussions with them, mainly because they want to maintain a positive relationship to try and safeguard Hong Kong's position. And the steps they've taken to date have been really very limited. So they extended a partial arms embargo applied to China to Hong Kong. And then back in November, there was some talk of China-specific designations under the human rights sanctions. That didn't materialise. And interestingly, in December, the UK placed 10 people on the list, so people from Gambia, Pakistan, Russia, Venezuela, and no Chinese individuals were placed on the list. And I think that really tells you everything you need to know, that I think Britain will very much engage in soft diplomacy in this area rather than taking any aggressive steps.
And Tom, one subset of that is Huawei, right? I mean, Huawei has been a big issue in the United States. It actually has already come up in the confirmation hearing for the nominee for Secretary of Commerce. It's become a big issue there, even though her comments, at least as I read them, were very minimal. It turned into an issue. How do you think that will play, the Huawei issue will play in the UK? Because as I understand it, there's been some pressure from the US to have Huawei kind of kicked out of the UK with respect to the 5G conversation. Is that likely to get some traction now that after Brexit?
The UK definitely has flip-flopped on Huawei. It was actually, until relatively recently, it was still envisaging that they would have a major role in 5G. As I understand, they still have some role in 5G. It's just the more sensitive areas they are being excluded from. But Huawei is a very big company in the UK. Very significant trading relationships with them and other Chinese telecoms and tech companies, and I certainly don't see us mirroring what the US have done against Huawei or any of the other telecoms or tech companies. Sue, I don't know if you've got a different view on that.
Just a related question on that too, Tom. In terms of obviously the U.S. has aggressively used the entity list to go after Huawei and some of the other big Chinese tech companies. They've taken a number of other measures as well, including using the attack on sort of the publicly traded securities and limitations there for U.S. persons, and which is sort of an unprecedented, unorthodox step. But one area where Tim and I certainly are seeing this day in, day out at this point is just sort of basic export controls restrictions with respect to China. Now, obviously, the U.S. has had an embargo for many, many years, an arms embargo, but the sort of tightening of just general export control restrictions, in particular with regard to semiconductors and other sort of strategically valuable technology that maybe wasn't a few years ago seen as the most sensitive, but now I think is viewed by U.S. policymakers as quite sensitive and quite valuable to U.S. security. Any sort of trends or any sort of efforts or concerns in that vein out of the UK that there might be a tightening up of certain types of technologies that can flow freely to China?
So there are changes to our national security laws about who can acquire companies that own and develop sensitive tech and own sensitive intellectual property. But from an export control perspective, I'm not aware of any tightening of the licensing policy. So dual use goods you have to get a license to export to China. I'm not aware of any policy change that would lead to a license not being granted. There is some discussion about putting in place extra controls for goods that could be used in internal repression in Xinjiang, but not specific to the tech side. That might develop, but at the moment I'm not seeing any mood music around that.
So,
Okay. Oh, go ahead, Tim.
I was just going to
Go ahead.
say, so one thing that we haven't talked about, at least specifically post Brexit, is enforcement. And so, Sue, if you could tell us, kind of give us your predictions about where OFSI, the counterpart to OFAC over in the UK, will be headed post Brexit. And I know that even before Brexit, it was starting to flex its muscles. But where do you see it headed post Brexit?
Yeah, I mean, OFSI has surprised me with its enforcement powers, if I'm honest. When the civil enforcement regime was first introduced, I was incredibly skeptical that anything would really result from it, because OFSI is not as well funded as OFAC is. And I have to say the first couple of enforcements were, pretty unimpressive. It was £5,000 and £10,000 fines for 250 breaches worth £250, and you think, well, why did you even bother on that? But the latest one coming, against Standard Chartered, has really made me, and I think other sanctions practitioners, sit up and pay attention. First of all, I mean, they imposed a significant penalty, but also because you can see the ministerial review at work, and it's working. Again, I was very skeptical about ministerial review. Was it really likely that the minister would review OFSI's decision and take a decision against his or her own ministry? And the answer is they do. They are independent, and that's been a big surprise. What do I think is going to happen going forward? I think OFSI probably has the bit between its teeth and is, feeling quite confident now.
Yeah, I mean, that enforcement action, at least from even looking at it from a U.S. perspective, was relatively surprising. I mean, you had a voluntary disclosure, you had an exception to the Russian sanctions that Standard Chartered was trying to apply, and apparently applied right more often than not, even in connection with the potential transactions that were at issue, and got it wrong after it turned itself in, and still got fined £20 million. I mean, that actually seems high from a U.S. perspective. I think if you had that sort of inadvertent, good faith mistake that was voluntarily disclosed, there really aren't a lot of big enforcement actions that have those characteristics in the United States. So it seemed pretty high to me.
Do you know, Tim, actually, it's what's quite interesting about that fine. So that you're right, they got a 30% discount for self-disclosure credit, but the fine was based on the value of the transactions in breach of the Russian sanctions. They could only take into account the contraventions since the civil penalty regime that Sue mentioned had come into force, which was in April 2017. So all of the earlier transactions that were also in breach of the Russian sanctions were not taken into account for calculating the penalty. And had they been taken into account, the fine would have been closer to £60 million. So it does show, I think, that there is, as Sue says, that this civil penalty regime that's been put in place has real teeth, and the banks understand that.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think we devoted an entire segment on the podcast to this last year when it was announced, because I think we sat up and took notice right away, and we're like, wow, this is quite aggressive. This is, sort of has some of the hallmarks of an OFAC style enforcement action and resolution with a big bank. But to bring it back to the banks again, because we've now talked about this a few different times. I mean, have either of you seen, as a result of this action, perhaps any change in behavior among financial institutions, either your clients or the folks that your clients are interacting with, in terms of perhaps a more cautious approach? Or, obviously we know traditionally the big banks, the big global banks, have feared OFAC kind of first and foremost, and then it's sort of everybody else is a distant, second or third. But do you think now this has yielded or will yield sort of a change in the compliance calculus and the enforcement risk calculus?
I suppose my answer to that is that the UK financial institutions' natural reaction was to say no in any event. That hasn't changed. It's only got a stronger impetus. I will say no.
Um, so I've certainly seen banks issuing. So Sue deals more with banks in the financial service sector. I'm more on the trade sanctions side, so I deal with companies that are having to interact with banks and get finance from them. I've seen that my clients are receiving lots of questionnaires from their banks asking them to disclose whether they're operating in particular countries, who their customers are, and they're having to give more sanctions undertakings. Whether that's driven by the US or the UK or both, it's probably both. I think is the reality of it. What I think is interesting about OFSI is they have this dual approach. So they've hammered Standard Charter. They've got their case that sends out the big warning message. On the other side, they're going for a strategy of engagement and encouragement with other sectors that aren't as sophisticated as the banking sector and aren't as familiar with sanctions regimes. So they're getting in touch with energy companies, telecoms companies, travel companies, whole sectors who previously weren't aware of sanctions, and they're telling them, we have identified, usually through a bank telling us, that you are party to a transaction that breaches financial sanctions. Here's your first warning. Get on top of compliance, get it sorted, and if it happens again, you'll be subject to enforcement. And I've had numerous clients who've had that level of engagement with OFSI.
That's really interesting because I think that in some ways mirrors the approach that OFAC took, 20 years ago or 15 years ago, which is, the banks and the financial sector, obviously, number one sort of top regulatory priority because it's the Treasury Department, that's obvious. But then as they kind of fanned out and more industries, I think, were essentially put on notice that they have these same obligations, there was some of those type of communications. You still see that now. I mean, we comment on that now when we see things, devoted or targeted at the maritime sector or the fine art sector or the, some maybe less traditional industries or sectors that are not, maybe sanctions are not top of mind. But I think at some point it flips, and then to your point, Tom, when is the enforcement hammer going to drop on one of those because somebody has disregarded it or, has maybe done something, purposefully illegal once they, were noticed up essentially.
And Brian, the main this obviously deals with financial sanctions. The trade sanctions enforcement piece is also developing quite rapidly in the UK. So trade sanctions and export controls are the domain of the HM Revenue and Customs for enforcement purposes. And in the vast majority of cases, they will ask companies to remediate and not to repeat their misconduct. They also have the power to impose what's called a compound penalty. And this is very opaque. It's not like OFSA. You don't get a big public announcement telling you about the issue and how the penalty was calculated. It's all kind of done behind the scenes. And what we're seeing is that UK exporters who breach trade sanctions are being subject to investigation by HMRC. In the main, they're getting to agree compound penalties. And in the last year, the compound penalty rate has significantly increased. And I think that's something that's a trend we will see developing. And a particular area of focus for HMRC appears to be Russia and breaches of the Russian oil and gas trade sanctions.
That's actually a great pivot because we've touched upon and danced around Russia a little bit, but we haven't really talked about Russia squarely. So I think maybe we can move to that because I think we expect certainly on the U.S. side, after a relatively early in the Trump administration with the passage of CAATSA and some of the new sanctions that went into place, targeting Nord Stream 2 and the Russian military and intelligence sectors and oil and gas, obviously. There was sort of a very dormant period due to the sort of political realities in the U.S. But now I think there's going to be a reinvigoration on the U.S. side with election interference, Navalny, other activities that the U.S. is deeply concerned about and is likely to act upon. So what would you say in terms of the next phase of UK enforcement on the Russia sanctions front? Sue, what would you think is anything new that is kind of in the on the horizon here with the in the post-Brexit UK sanctions era?
I think the main focus is going to be on human rights. I think it's all going to come back to human rights. I mean, it fits with the fact that ESG is the subject du jour anyway. But I cannot see the UK wanting to get into any big argument either with Germany or indeed with Russia in relation to Nord Stream 2. It's not going to want to go there. The reality is that there are vast swathes of Eastern Europe that depend upon Russia for their energy requirements. And it's not going to be a very happy relationship post-Brexit if the UK suddenly goes, do you know what? We don't really like that. So we're going to try and stop the financing that's going on in the UK, in the city. I just don't see it. That's not to say that the UK will not want to send messages, and it will send messages, but I think it will be primarily human rights based, trying to express concern around, the repression on free speech. If something were to happen again in the UK, in terms of,
Another poisoning?
poisoning
Yeah.
people, then
Right.
query whether we would go a little bit further. But even if when you look at the history of that, we stamped our feet a lot and shouted, but didn't actually do very much.
Yeah, I agree. Trade sanctions is interesting because the new UK legislation does extend the trade sanctions. So the EU sanctions were the oil and gas sanctions. I'm thinking about particularly were focused on oil and gas projects in Russia. The UK have extended the oil and gas restrictions to any projects which have a Russian connection. So if you are, yeah, yeah. So I think we'll see some enforcement around that, and that will be companies will have inadvertently exported to a project in Africa that's actually been
Right.
run for a Russian company, and somebody will make a disclosure, and we'll have some enforcement. But I think on the policy front, I'm completely aligned with Sue.
Maybe I can ask this as a final parting shot. One kind of on the enforcement front, uh, I think one thing that we've been contemplating and that we've seen some evidence of in the past year or two with respect to the U.S. Department of Justice collaborating more with SFO on certain investigations and big national cross-border matters. Do we think what are your thoughts, maybe Sue first and then Tom, on prospects for greater collaboration now, maybe in the post-Brexit area between whether it's OFSI or the trade sanctions authorities with U.S. authorities on those same type of investigations and broad kind of cross-border matters? Do you think that there's more appetite or more prospect for that we'll see more of these jointly announced kind of big splash? I'm thinking about Airbus, obviously was a big one. That was sort of all of the, France, UK, US. Do we think we'll see more things like that on the trade side?
Definitely. I think the Sanctions Act makes specific allowance for a much greater degree of cooperation with enforcement agencies outside of the EU. If you looked at the civil penalties regime, the guidance around that basically stated that they would communicate and liaise with other competent authorities within the EU, whereas the new Sanctions Act, and it's not so new now, it's 2018, makes clear that they can liaise and provide information and communicate with other aligned authorities. And I think I might be being a little bit cynical here, but I think it's just giving effect in legal terms to what's probably been going on already.
Yeah, I agree, and you can see it seeing a lot of liaison with the SFO and the DOJ, some positive, some not so. In respect of big bribery cases, there are some of those cases in the pipeline. On the tax side of things, Britain, America, and other countries have a formal arrangement where they're liaising on tax evasion. and you're going to see that in the sanctions and the export control piece. And the reality is, if there's an export control breach, if it's a US re-export control breach, somebody makes a disclosure to the US authorities, you're going to find that there's French, British, German parts, and therefore you're going to have parallel disclosures, and that's an area of work that we're certainly seeing, and it's one of the reasons we're in touch with Millar and Chevalier so often, because of the cross-border nature of this work now.
Yeah, I mean, we always assume that there's conversations between OFSI and OFAC when we have matters that touch on both, but I'm not sure I've seen that actually taking place, but it sounds like it's happening more and more. I mean, you've got to assume it'll happen, but whether they do talk is a different matter. In the criminal side, we have seen the situation where both where both the DOJ and SFO are supposedly in contact, but they've put us in between and had us be the intermediary. Well, tell the SFO this and tell DOJ that. They didn't actually directly talk to each other, but I assume that's improving in the last few years.
I can attest to the fact that intergovernmental cooperation as well as intra-governmental cooperation is not always what it is cracked up to be or what it is styled as. It's not quite as seamless as others might think. So, yeah, I agree. I agree with all that.
I think it's slightly easier in the trade space because there's not the kind of concurrent jurisdiction or battle for who's going to have jurisdiction. There's clear cut. That's a US breach. That's a UK breach. So I think it's an area that lends itself to it, and an area that we need to be alive to. Certainly, if I come across a UK sanctions breach, the next thing I'm thinking is there a US breach that we need to deal with?
Right. All right. So with that, I think we are. I think that's basically everything we wanted to cover today. So I guess I'll pass to Sue and Tom for any final thoughts, but I think we're just about ready to conclude here. So Sue, any final thoughts, any prognostications perhaps? Tim and I like to wildly speculate about what is coming in the future on the US side. So we invite you to do the same, and with no repercussions, because again, you're not giving legal advice, these are your own personal thoughts. So anything you wanna offer up about what we talked about today or anything else?
I'm going to say that I think there is going to be a JCPOA 2.0 in around 12 to 15 months.
We look forward to having you back on the podcast when that is ready. So that, or if not before then, but certainly then to celebrate your prognostication.
Absolutely, and no consequences if you're wrong. That's the beauty of this thing.
So I'm going to say that Britain's going to push extremely hard for a US trade deal. And if you can take chlorinated chicken out of the equation and make your tariffs on Scotch whiskey a bit cheaper, then I think we're done. And maybe we should get the negotiators on this podcast. From an export control and sanctions perspective, I think in the next 12 months we'll see OFSI imposing a significant fine outside of the financial services sector, potentially telecoms, maybe pharma. And what's happening outside of the financial services sector is the area that interests me, because I see a lot of these companies now taking sanctions extremely seriously, partly because of the attitude of the banks, but also because they're recognizing the enforcement risk that is present.
All right, that's great. Those are some perfectly that's a perfectly well-tuned prognostications. That's just like the way we like to do it here on Embargoed. So, well, Sue, Tom, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciated this.
Really
this has been
fun.
really fun, educational, fun. So thank you both, and we will let you go now. So enjoy your weekend. So that was great. Thank you to our friends Sue Millar and Tom Stocker for joining us today to talk all things UK sanctions, export controls, trade in the post-Brexit UK world. That was fun, and I think is going to encourage us to have more interesting guests and friends from around the world join us in the future.
Yeah, I mean, two quick thoughts, because it was really fun listening to them. One is I think the progression of OFSI actually seems to mirror quite a bit, quite a few years later, but the progression of OFAC, where OFAC, around the 2000s, their big function seemed to be finding people who bought Cuban cigars, $500, $1,000 fines. And then obviously they progress to the banks, and now they progress beyond the banks. It seems like OFSI is making that same transition, probably a lot faster than OFAC has, but they've got a roadmap to follow. The other thing is just Nord Stream 2. It's so hard to wrap your mind around what a political football that is. I mean, we keep imposing more and more sanctions against Nord Stream 2 in the states like it's some consensus issue that is easy to resolve, but clearly the EU and the UK really do feel otherwise.
Yeah, and I think on that latter point, and we've said this, I think, pretty recently when we talked about the new sanctions that were imposed. It may be just too little, too late, and also for the U.S. from the U.S. perspective, and also without the will and the strength of the UK and the EU to get behind the U.S. position, it just doesn't seem like there's going to be enough of an obstacle erected there to sort of ultimately deter or derail the project. It just seems like it's a matter of when, not if, it will be completed. But we shall see. Okay, and with that, so again, thanks to Sue and Tom, and now that we've completed sort of the main portion of the episode for today, we will pause for our favorite sound effect, and we'll get into the lightning round. So we're going to hit 3 topics. We're going to do these very quickly. A couple of these in particular, the first one we will most certainly come back to in the not too distant future. And so topic number 1 in the lightning round is the Burma executive order. So obviously on the last episode, we spent a lot of time talking about and speculating what was going to happen with respect to Myanmar and the military coup there. What was the U.S. reaction going to be? What was the approach going to be? I think so for those who haven't seen, obviously there was an executive order that was issued on February 11, so just over a week ago, that is pretty, I would say, traditional in terms of a sort of your typical standing up of a new. It's sort of a new, although it's essentially a re-standing up of an old program, a new program in terms of imposing blocking sanctions, or the ability to impose blocking sanctions. That is in. It could be deployed quite broadly. Obviously, there is the provision that targets the defense sector, but also any other sector of the Myanmar economy. So that's very similar to the approach we've seen in Venezuela and some other programs that it sort of allows the U.S. and allows OFAC to sort of broadly target other swaths of the economy. But in its initial deployment and the initial designations that we saw, it's really just targeted at the military leadership and at 3 companies that are in the gems and jewelry industry that are purported to be sort of sources of income and revenue for the military. So I think it's in line, I think, with what we were discussing, what we were expecting. It's a fairly measured, I guess, initial volley of designations, but obviously there's the potential for much more. And also the big question, of course, is this going to be worked and deployed in concert with diplomacy and other actions and other levers to try to ultimately achieve what the U.S. seems to want here, which is to get the civilian democratically elected government back in place over time. So that's really, in sum, what we've seen. Tim, what are your sort of quick thoughts on that?
Two quick takeaways that are kind of at least implicit in what you just said, Brian. I mean, one is there is room to grow. So it did start small. It started targeted. It's really at the coup leaders. And then I guess my second point was, who knew that the coup leaders were into the bling? I mean, like they precious gems is where they start with trying to really put the squeeze to the leaders of the Myanmar military. I had no idea, but I guess OFAC knows better.
So one thing I'll say on that front is we did discuss the last episode that there are a couple of well-known conglomerates that are controlled by the military that are large sources of revenue. These entities are controlled by one of those conglomerates. The conglomerate itself not designated at this point, although again, room to grow. We could see more. That would I think take out a big swath of economic power and revenue and just sort of economic vitality, I think, from the country. And so I think that's why we're seeing a more targeted approach at first, but we could see that in the future. We don't know. So anyway, I think Tim's exactly right. There's room to grow. So we shall see. And of course, I'm sure we will be back to the Burma executive order in the future as this situation develops over the next months. So with that, let's go to lightning round topic number 2, which is Yemen.
So Yemen, this is another one that we've talked about on earlier podcasts. At the end of the Trump administration, Ansarallah, which is essentially the leaders of the rebellion in Yemen and aligned with the Houthi tribe that is in control of the North Yemen. The Trump administration designated them near the end of the Trump as Trump's term was coming to an end, and essentially took sides in the Yemen civil war by doing that. We thought that might not be long for this world, and that turned out to be right very recently. So, on February 16th, so less than a month in, the Biden administration removed Ansarallah and the related designated entities and people from the SDN list. So now essentially we're back to where we were beforehand, which was that you have both sides of the civil war are still, you can still deal with them. They also, OFAC also repealed the related general licenses, which had created that situation almost immediately after President Biden took office. But I think there was a warning that went along with this removal, which was they're still going to watch carefully what's going on there. So I don't think they're essentially taking the Ansarallah side, and they didn't want it to be read that way. They're just trying to go back to more of a position of neutrality in terms of the two sides of the civil war.
Yeah, and I think the interesting thing is, and also along with that, the State Department revoked the designations relating to the foreign terrorist organization status as well. That was all done in concert. I just think that one of the interesting things that we talked about when this first came up, right in the final days of the Trump administration, was, well, this is clearly just trying to throw up roadblocks and throw up obstacles to sort of lock in and solidify foreign policy of the outgoing administration. And the answer here is that it took a month. It took a month to completely erase that, essentially.
And really less time, less time as a
Yeah.
practical matter, because the general license came in,
like
almost
a week in. Yeah, exactly. So anyway, just interesting from that perspective to just sort of keep that in mind. And that the last topic we're going to talk about is also sort of partially related to that as well. But it just is a reminder that, U.S. foreign policy, U.S. national security policy, U.S. kind of sanctions policy is quite fungible at the end of the day. And the folks that hold the levers of power have a lot of ability to sort of shift on a dime and shift in completely upend and erase essentially what has happened before. So, and with that, let's go to
elections matter. I think that's the...
Yeah. Well, there's that. That is definitely true. We believe that on Embargoed. But I think that's just an interesting lesson here to sort of see play out in real concrete terms. And then the last topic number 3 for the lightning round, and I'm proud of us for actually going at lightning speed today for a change, is WeChat and TikTok. So just last week, it became clear, it became known on the same day actually as I believe the Burma executive order was announced. I think this was February 11. There were a couple of court filings, one out in California, one in DC, and I will just read the relevant language, which says, as the Biden administration has taken office, the Department of Commerce has begun a review of certain recently issued agency actions, including the Secretary's prohibitions regarding the WeChat mobile application at issue in this appeal. In relation to those prohibitions, the department plans to conduct an evaluation of the underlying record justifying those prohibitions. The government will then be better positioned to determine whether the national security threat described in the President's August 6, 2020 executive order and the regulatory purpose of protecting the security of Americans and their data continue to warrant the identified prohibitions. This is, I think, exactly what we were expecting to see. So I think we'll take credit for calling this calling this pretty accurately. There was essentially the identical filing in the TikTok litigation as well in DC. And I think they haven't come out to say it. There was some sort of caveat language afterward that the U.S. government remains committed to being sort of tough on China and protecting U.S. Privacy and data security interests. But I think for all practical purposes, this is the death knell for these executive orders, and I think these are going to be. I would be shocked if either the executive orders are sort of revoked, or the prohibition certainly I think will be, if not revoked, then substantially reduced, and will essentially moot the litigation that's going on right now. That would be what I would expect at this point. I don't know how quickly that'll happen, but I would think, again, we don't have a Secretary of Commerce yet. We don't have some of the senior political appointees yet in the Commerce Department, but that should be coming soon. And so I would say in the next 30 to 60 days, we'll probably get another communication and perhaps an actual concrete policy pronouncement, sort of putting these things to rest permanently.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've said it in earlier episodes, but both of these actions seemed idiosyncratic, not very well justified, and potentially, given the timing and the main spokesperson for them, politically motivated as part of an election. And so, I think it's appropriate, and we basically anticipated that the Biden administration would want to review it. That doesn't mean I'm not sure it's the death knell. I mean, I think you might see something come out of this, to the extent there really were justifications there that haven't been publicly revealed. Perhaps there will be some action that comes out of it. I think whatever action happens will be very different. So in that sense, it's a death knell. I don't think we're going to see these weird sorts of designations coming out of the Commerce Department that prohibit, app transactions in the way that happened before. But there might be, this might not be the end for WeChat and TikTok of any, action by the U.S. government related to whatever was driving those earlier ones. We'll wait and see. But I think it's appropriate to do a review, because this whole both of these executive orders made very little sense, at least to me.
Yeah, I think, as we've said before, it's not that the underlying concerns have changed at all. They have not. It is the sort of means and methods of achieving those ends potentially, or addressing those concerns. And I do think so. I agree that it doesn't mean that there will be nothing, that the slate will be sort of wiped clean, so to speak, for WeChat and TikTok. But I think in this iteration, or this version 1.0 of whatever the restrictions were in place that never really took effect, I think we are essentially seeing the end of that. I should add too that remember that there's also the divestiture of TikTok by ByteDance that's floating in the background, and the reports are now that is about to potentially fall apart, or be or that CFIUS and company are ready to perhaps sort of rethink or walk away from the previous position on that as well. So I think, again, I'm certain we will come back to WeChat and TikTok on a future episode, because we can't quit WeChat and TikTok. But I think there's a lot of shifting ground here, and it's now, these are the first sort of indications that we're about to see sort of real rethinking of the U.S. position on this.
Yeah, one quick final comment on this is that it is significant, at least to me, that the divestiture order related to Chinese military companies, that whole program, does not seem to be, at least immediately, being rethought by the U.S. And that was, another kind of late term executive order that the Trump administration issued. There's still guidance coming out on those post Trump, and so while these executive orders may not be long for this world, that one seems to have survived into the Biden administration, and in some sense maybe more vigorous.
Yeah, so we shall see, and obviously we'll be back, I'm sure, to cover these on a future episode. So with that, I think we are done. We are wrapped for this week. Again, thank you very much to Sue Millar, Tom Stalker, for joining us and for providing their expertise and their insights on what's happening in the UK and what they're expecting in the future in a post-Brexit UK on the sanctions, export controls, and trade side of things. We will, as always, be back in a couple of weeks. I think we'll be back to sort of a normal, more typical format in 2 weeks and cover a few things that have come up that we just didn't have time to cover today. And I'm sure, hopefully, there will be no military coups in the next 2 weeks that will force us to have it put that to the top of the
or
of the
do an
pecking order
emergency
for our agenda.
podcast. We could have our first
Yeah,
emergency podcast.
yeah. Let's hope not.
No, I
But
agree.
in any event, so thank you to everybody as always for tuning in. Until next time, stay safe and stay sanctions free.
That was really fun, and I thought Sue and Tom were great. So maybe we should do that again next month. Not the next show, but maybe next month with respect to some other friends.
Yeah, exactly.
Stay sanctions free, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Bye.